Compare the ancient Inca culture to the ancient Egyptian culture. The Inca were located in South America and the Egyptians in Africa, separate continents divided by the ocean. The two cultures seemingly had no contact, yet many of the artifacts that have been discovered had striking similarities. The Inca and Egyptians built structures of stone. The Inca constructed terrace walls and temples using massive pieces of stone, fitting them perfectly together. Though both the Inca and the Egyptians built structures with huge stones, the Egyptians used uniformly cut blocks compared to the Inca that used randomly shaped stones. Both the Inca and the Egyptian structures are built with blocks leaning inward. It's believed this was done to make the structures more stable in the event of an earthquake. Pyramidal structures were common to both cultures. The Egyptian pyramids were used as tombs and were constructed to be in alignment with cardinal points. In contrast, the Inca pyramidal structures were used to revere the gods. Only a few bodies have been found entombed in the Inca pyramids. Additionally, the Inca pyramids were stair-stepped, but the Egyptians constructed both stair-stepped and smooth-sided pyramids. The difference in the structures could be attributed to the terrain of the Inca. They dwelled in the upper regions of the Andean mountains. Because they lived on sloping land, they were accustomed to constructing terraces for agriculture. Their stair-stepping design could have naturally been carried into their building construction. One of the differences in the architecture of the two peoples is the shape of the doorways. The Inca doorways tend to be trapezoidal, but the Egyptians seem to favor rectangular openings. Both cultures constructed obelisks, which are stone pillars. These were often covered in carvings. The obelisks were symbols of masculine strength and fertility. The Inca and Egyptians both revered their dead, and mummification was used by both cultures. The Inca and Egyptians believed in life after death, so they took measures to preserve the bodies. The Inca would typically bury the bodies in a sitting position in what is known as a mummy bundle. Within the wrappings of cotton, the body would be buried with personal items and religious offerings. Not all Inca mummies were buried. Some were placed in tombs above ground where they were worshipped. Worshipping the mummies of Inca rulers was an important part of the Inca religion. The living would consult with the mummified rulers on important issues. Each of these king mummies still held rights of ownership to all their property, and they had living servants. Egyptians were much more focused on the mummification process, but it was generally reserved for the bodies of the wealthy. The internal organs, lung, intestines, stomach, and liver, were treated with great respect. They were removed and placed into vessels called canopic jars. The heart was placed back into the body. The body was cleansed, then covered in salt for 70 days to dry it out. At 40 days, the body was stuffed with cloth or sand to help it retain the human shape. At the end of a 7-day period, the body was wrapped in cloth and placed in a sarcophagus. After the mummification process was complete, the body was adorned with a gold mask and the neck was draped with a heavy necklace. The mummified bodies were often placed within a coffin called a sarcophagus that was designed with the appearance of a god, local hero, or the deceased. Like the Inca, the mummies were buried with personal belongings, but the earliest dynasties of Egyptians went even further. They took their slaves and sometimes family members and government officials with them to the afterlife. In recent history, victims of Inca human sacrifices have been discovered in the icy peaks of the Andes Mountains. These bodies were basically freeze-dried rather than mummified and were undiscovered for hundreds of years. Because the bodies were left intact, scientists have gained further insight into how sacrificial victims met their demise, as well as the types of clothing they wore and the health of the Inca people. Archaeologists have been uncertain if the Egyptian people performed human sacrifices. In 2001, an archaeological dig in Abydos, Egypt, uncovered evidence that seemed to confirm human sacrifice did take place in the first or possibly second dynasty. Unlike the Inca, who made sacrifices to appease their gods, These appeared to be graves of servants and perhaps even cherished family members and government officials of the deceased ruler Aha. It is speculated that they were poisoned and then buried while still alive, as there is evidence of movement in the graves, but no evidence of physical violence to the bodies. The graves were located around the tomb of Aha so they could join him in the afterlife. Skeletons from both cultures show evidence of cranial deformation where the skull is elongated. What is really interesting is that evidence of cranial deformation has been found in many areas of the world. This suggests that either elongated skulls may have been a natural occurrence in the very earliest days of man, or more likely, intentional cranial deformation of babies was a practice that spread with migrating populations. Inca dwellings were simple structures made of stone and mud with thatched roofs. They had no furnishings. Egyptian homes were generally made of mud mixed with straw that was baked into bricks. There was no timber in the area, and only the wealthy had homes built of stone. Egyptians did have some furniture, but most people sat on the floor. The most common piece of Egyptian furnishings were a low stool and reed baskets used for storage. For the Inca, preserving food facilitated their population growth. Their storehouses are said to have had 3 to 7 years of food, such as dried meat and freeze-dried potatoes and other tubers. The potato was a staple food, and they had many different varieties. One of the potatoes was even used as a sweetener. The Inca primarily drank chicha, which contained alcohol. Egyptians all drank beer made from barley, and they drank wine. Unlike the Inca, the Egyptian diet was dependent upon social standing. The poor ate unleavened bread, onions, and fish. The upper class had a variety of breads and vegetables, honey, meat, and fruits like dates, apricots, and grapes. Like the Inca, the Egyptians stored food. They had silos for grain, and fish, meat, fruits, and vegetables were dried and salted. While the Inca freeze-dried their vegetation, the Inca used the sun and wind to preserve their food. The difference between the techniques used to preserve food can be attributed to a climate. Each used the climate to their best advantage. Agriculture was important to both cultures, and each had to be creative to successfully grow crops. For the Inca, rainfall was unreliable, so they devised a system of canals to move water from nearby rivers to mountain slopes. They constructed terrace slopes so that the water would not run off, and to combat erosion and make farming simpler. The Egyptians could count on heavy rains starting in early July. The land along the river would flood until late November. This began the farming season, and it was perfect because the floods brought in nutrient-rich soils. But the Egyptians also practiced water management through a technique called basin irrigation. By constructing banks of soil both perpendicular and parallel to the river, they created basins for holding water. Floodwater from the Nile River could be directed into the basin, where it would stay until the soil was amply watered. At that time, the basins could be drained off and new crops could be planted. Both the Inca and Egyptians had social stratification, but the Egyptian social structure was sharply divided. Both naturally placed the ruling entity at the top of the power structure, and the peasants and slaves were at the bottom. The gods of ancient people were connected with nature. The Inca and the Egyptians both placed great importance on the sun. Each had a solar deity. The Inca sun god was Inti, and the Egyptian solar god was Ra. The sun god was a prevalent theme in the art of both cultures. The similarity could be explained by their astute awareness of the constancy of the sun and how it affected the seasons. Many ancient cultures looked to nature for answers. The overwhelming power of the sun must have made it appear to be a supreme entity. The Inca held a rite of passage for males when they turned 14 to honor the transition from boyhood to adulthood. The ceremony was publicly performed and was generally reserved for the elite. The Egyptians practiced ritual circumcision. This was to transform the boy into the man and let him be privy to ancient mysteries. The priest performed the procedure publicly using a stone blade. The Inca had no system of writing. Instead, they used a method of storytelling in which the adult males of the family would teach their male children to recite their history. But history was also preserved by the use of a quipu, a knotted string device used by accountants. The quipu recorded numeric data using the decimal system. To distinguish different types of data, the strings would be different colors and lengths. Knots along the strings were the numbers. The quipu recorded all types of data, like the takeover of villages, taxes, census of game from a hunt, and thereby they left a history of their events. Much more is known about the Egyptians because they developed a formal system of writing called hieroglyphics. Hieroglyphics are characters that represent ideas or things. Writing hieroglyphics took a lot of time, so the Egyptians even created a cursive script called hieratic, which was used for most of the writing done on ink, in ink on papyrus. The Inca were ingenious people whose architecture still holds a great deal of interest to people from all points of the globe. As a result, the areas of Peru where the Inca structures still stand attract many tourists annually. Tourism boosts the economy. The favorite destination is Machu Picchu. Tourism also provides an opportunity for local artisans to sell their wares. The Inca are proud of their heritage and still hold a reverence for the sun as the ancients did. Today, the most important of the Peruvian festivals is the Inti Raymi, which is dedicated to the sun god Inti. The Inca were early practitioners of freeze-drying foods to preserve them. Agriculturally, the Inca preferred terracing, which is still in use today. Other major influences on modern society were Inca roads, bridges, and courier systems. The Egyptians made great medical advances. They also greatly influenced astronomy, astrology, and science. The shape of the pyramid is in use around the world and is even found on our paper money. The lives of the ancient Egyptians captivate the imagination of many, and Egyptian-inspired art is widely available today. Movies and books about mummies and curses continue to entertain us and keep the intrigue of ancient Egypt alive. Through the Human Genome Project, we have scientific evidence that link all mankind together genetically. We are said to come from a single man and woman in Africa. The similarities found between the Inca and Egyptian people are due to migration northward through Africa and then westward across the Bering Strait and on into the Americas. Because the environment of the two cultures was different, each evolved as needed based on what the environment offered. Ancient cultures tend to revere the gods who embodied the natural elements, and this was true of the Inca and Egyptians. However, since they evolved separately, their gods took on slightly different looks and had unique names. Both cultures were agrarian, but grew different types of crops based on the soil and climate of their locations.